Arrivals at Tilbury. The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans. Many are ex-servicemen who know England. They served this country well. In Jamaica, they couldn't find work. Discouraged but full of hope, they sailed for Britain. Citizens of the British Empire coming to the mother country with good intent. Prodded by public opinion, the Colonial Office gives them a more cordial reception than was at first envisaged. Many are to be found jobs. Our reporter asks them what they want to do.
Now, why have you come to England?
To seek a job.
And what sort of job do you want?
Any type, so long as I get a good pay.
Some will go into industry, others intend to rejoin the service.
Now, you're ex-Air Force. Are you going back into the Air Force again?
Yes,
Did you know if you'll be accepted?
I think so.
Some plan to return to Jamaica when conditions improve.
I'd like to ask you, please, are you a single man?
I am a single man. Only my mother that is depending on me. And I'm also an ex-serviceman.
You're ex-service, RAF, are you?
RAF. I took a course in Scotland in case making, and I'm desirous of going back there to see if I can further, because I like it very much, and I'm trying to help myself and also help my mom.
Their spokesman sings his thanks to Britain.
Now, may I ask you your name?
Lord Kitchener.
Lord Kitchener. Now, I'm told that you are really the king of calypso singers, is that right?
Yes, that's
Well, now, will you
true.
sing for us?
Right now.
Yes?
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia, or Australia, but you must come back to London City. Well, believe me, I am speaking broad-mindedly. I am glad to know my mother country.
What you've just listened to are the cheery, optimistic words that Aldwin Roberts, better known as Lord Kitchener, the King of Calypso, sang as he arrived in Britain on the Empire Windrush in June 1948. What you're about to hear is a much less happy story. Hello, my friends. I hope you're safe and well, and thank you for tuning in to this bookmark's special event. My name's Brian Richardson. I'm a practicing barrister at Nexus Chambers in London and the very proud child of parents who came to Britain from the Caribbean during what has come to be known as the Windrush era, after that ship that Lord Kitchener disembarked. I've been involved in many anti-racist campaigns and activities for over 30 years now. One that I remember most vividly and I'm most proud of happened just 2 years ago. I remember the precise day, April the 20th, because it was the 50th anniversary of Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood speech, a speech that sent shivers down the spines of black communities up and down the country. I had been due to attend a brilliant event that was organised by Stand Up to Racism members in the very Birmingham hotel where Powell had made that speech, but instead I had to stay in London. The reason I stayed in London was because the local Stand Up to Racism group that is nearest to me in Brixton had organised an event in the aptly named Windrush Square in Brixton. It was an event that was organised to protest against what was coming to be known as the Windrush scandal. And on that day, thousands of people packed into the square to hear speeches by, among others, Diane Abbott, Patrick Vernon, one of the journalists responsible for breaking the Windrush scandal, and the Guardian journalist Gary Young. Within 10 days of that protest, the then Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, had resigned. Shortly afterwards, her successor, Sajid Javid, had announced a review which was finally published in March of this year, and the government announced the introduction of a compensation scheme. They also announced the introduction of Windrush Day. So every June we celebrate Windrush Day. It's no exaggeration to say that our guest this evening was absolutely instrumental to all of that. I had the pleasure of knowing Paul Foote. Paul was always a very funny, engaging and witty speaker, but more importantly, he was an outstanding campaigning journalist. In my humble opinion, Amelia Gentleman was the deserved recipient of the award that was founded in Paul Foot's name. And it's an absolute pleasure to introduce her this evening to talk about her fantastic book, The Windrush Betrayal. Amelia, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that really kind introduction, and thank you for taking the time to talk about this. It's incredibly moving to hear that clip that you showed of Lord Kitchener singing on his arrival and disembarking from the ship. It's a kind of always a very bittersweet thing to hear, because you feel on the one hand all of the optimism, and on the other hand you kind of know what is coming next. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, let's talk then specifically about your book. And let me begin, Amelia, by asking you this. How and when did you become aware of the issue that is the subject of the book?
I became aware of it in October 2017. I was sent an email by a worker at a charity in Wolverhampton, and it was a charity that I'd visited a couple of years earlier as part of a reporting trip in the area. In fact, to write a piece about Enoch Powell's constituency, and to write about issues of immigration there for the 2015 election. And the organisation, the Refugee and Migrant Centre in Wolverhampton is very active in supporting lots of people from the area. And they emailed me with a very arresting and alarming email that said that they were concerned about the imminent deportation of a woman who had been in Britain for 49 years. And just on the face of it, the kind of facts alone of the idea of a grandmother, this woman, Paulette Wilson, who'd been in Britain for almost half a century, had arrived here at the age of 10 from Jamaica, and hadn't left Britain since. The idea that the Home Office was trying to deport her and had already detained and arrested her and put her in Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre seemed really, really hard to understand. So that was the beginning of an investigation that took months, that to begin with really didn't attract very much interest from politicians or actually from the kind of wider media organisations across the UK. It was quite a frustrating and slow investigation to begin with. But 6 or 8 months later resulted in the events that you've just described, and the resignation of Amber Rudd and promises of complete reform that we're still to a certain extent waiting for. But if you don't mind, I'll maybe read the first chapter, the first page of the book that I've written, that gives a bit of an insight into what happened to Paulette Wilson.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you pack for a one-way journey back to the country you left when you were 10 and haven't visited for 50 years? Around lunchtime on the 24th of October 2017, staff at the Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre in Bedfordshire told 61-year-old Paulette Wilson to gather her belongings and get ready to be taken to another holding centre near Heathrow Airport, where she was due to be placed on a plane and sent back to Jamaica. After half a century in Britain, she had been classified as an illegal immigrant and was scheduled for imminent removal. Packing did not take long. The clothes she had been wearing when she was arrested a week earlier had been confiscated, leaving her with nothing she could call her own. She put the detention centre issued toothbrush and night clothes into a large plastic laundry bag, along with a towel, some soap, and some underwear which had been provided by the guards. She looked at the grey prison tracksuit she had been given and wondered how she would manage in Jamaica with no appropriate clothes and no money. Staff led her upstairs to an upstairs room to wait for a van to transfer her to Heathrow. For a moment, Paulette, a cook who had worked for a while in the House of Commons canteen, was quiet, dazed by her own terror. Then she asked if she could call her daughter, Natalie. She dialed the number, waited for Natalie to pick up, and began to scream. "They're taking me away, Natalie. You have to stop them."
Well,
so that's the beginning of the narrative, and it was a very, very disturbing meeting, I suppose, for me, when I did finally get to talk to Paulette and her daughter Natalie at their home in Wolverhampton, and began to try and understand what it was that had gone wrong, that had made the Home Office wrongly classify her as an illegal immigrant.
Yeah, I think I subsequently met Natalie and spoke on a platform with her, and it's an incredibly humbling experience. And they are, the way that they, through adversity, I suppose, they were forced to grow as people. They shouldn't have had to do it, but the way that they grew was incredibly powerful and incredibly humbling. Let me ask you what is probably, and I mean, you've answered what was going to be my second question, Amelia, which was, as an investigative journalist for a major international newspaper, you must be alerted to dozens, perhaps hundreds of stories. What was it about this one that captured your attention? I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is always really difficult as a journalist to focus on an individual's case and amplify that case and try and draw kind of wider conclusions from it. So often, and particularly now, my inbox is really full of very, very upsetting cases of Home Office mistakes, or Home Office apparent mistakes, or policy being implemented in a very, very cruel way. And it's difficult because you have to obviously read them, respond to individuals, and decide which instances you're going to focus on. Because as a kind of general rule of thumb, you have to focus on issues that are likely to affect a wide range of people, rather than just a kind of a terrible one-off. Otherwise, it's kind of unfair for readers to pull them into people's individuals' circumstances if it's not kind of illustrating a wider policy failing, I suppose. But with Paulette, that didn't seem to be the case. It seemed to me that it was just a completely mad mistake that had been made, because there could be no reason why an entirely law-abiding grandmother who'd led a kind of blameless existence in the UK for half a century would be arrested and detained. She was actually arrested twice. And it seemed like a really stupid waste of public money in the first instance, but also incredibly cruel to threaten somebody with being removed to a country they hadn't seen for 50 years. So yeah, in a way, it was quite an easy decision to pursue that as a story, but it wasn't immediately obvious that there was a wider problem. It was only when we published that piece, and within kind of instantly, I began to get phone calls and emails to my Guardian address from people who were similarly affected, or from people who knew other people who were affected. Quite often, because of the age of those affected, it was emails or phone calls I was getting from their children who were very disturbed about the treatment being meted out to their parents. And in the day after the publication of the piece in The Guardian about Paulette Wilson, I was called by the son of somebody called Anthony Bryan, who had also been twice arrested and twice sent to immigration removal centres, had spent 5 weeks in detention, and who was at that time being threatened also with removal to Jamaica, a country that he also had left as I think he was an 8 when he came here to join his parents, and where he which he hadn't visited in the intervening half a century. I went and interviewed him, and in talking to him, I began to understand that actually this might not be a kind of series of 2 very similar mistakes, but there might be something kind of more systemic going on that was causing it. But it did take me a long time to understand what those problems were.
Is Anthony? Is he the one who was on the dramatization?
Yeah, it's an amazing film, and if you haven't seen it, it's really, really worth watching.
It's incredibly powerful.
It's called Sitting in Limbo, and it's on the BBC iPlayer at the moment. It's a kind of 90-minute film about exactly what happened to him. Yeah. And as a journalist, it's kind of, I felt amazed to see that film because it's brilliant, but it's slightly dispiriting because I spent kind of 2 years writing over and over again about this issue. But there's something about the power of drama that you see in 90 minutes. You absolutely understand everything, and you're completely immersed in his life and what went wrong. Yeah. It's a brilliant drama written by his brother. Yeah,
it must have been a bit weird to see yourself dramatized there as well.
Oh yeah, totally thrilling. Yeah, a complete career highlight. I come on for 30 seconds and I ask a couple of questions, but yeah, really, really fun.
Okay, let's get on to, I suppose, a really serious question here. So clearly, it wasn't just the case of a few isolated individuals. How was it, Amelia, that the people that you write about, Paulette, Anthony and others, came to be classified as illegal immigrants?
Well, that took me probably much longer than it should have done for me to understand. But I think you have to remember that 2.5 years ago, although a number of hostile environment immigration policies had been introduced, and although it was kind of, I think, 3 or 4 years since the immigration legislation that brought those into force had been passed, actually the notion of the hostile environment wasn't incredibly well understood. It wasn't something that kind of trips off people's tongues as it does now. So I was puzzled by it, and I asked as many people as I could. I spoke to lawyers, I spoke to law centres, I spoke to charities, to MPs, and tried to get to the roots of what might be happening. And it's fair to say that most people were confused. That's not to say, I mean, some lawyers were completely on top of it, but I didn't immediately find the right lawyers to talk to, and it became clear kind of only over a period of a few months. But there were two problems, and one's a kind of historical problem, and the second problem was the introduction of the hostile environment. So I try and give a summary of it, and I apologize in advance if there are historians or immigration law experts if I'm kind of simplifying it. But it begins with the arrival of the ship in 1948, and also some immigration legislation passed in 1948 that gave effective free movement between Britain's colonies, or soon to be Commonwealth countries, and Britain, so that for tens of thousands of people in the 1950s and 1960s, hundreds of thousands of people coming from the Caribbean, it wasn't a kind of restricted immigration process to begin with. You could come from Jamaica You could take a boat, later on a plane, and you could be freely landed in the UK. You'd have a stamp in your passport, but you wouldn't necessarily have seen yourself as emigrating or immigrating, because you were moving to the mother country. It was a kind of system of free movement, essentially. So people who came here, they came using passports that look very similar to the passports that we used to have, and the ones that we may or may not have again after Brexit. But they came using those kind of black passports, and they would say marked on them "citizen of the UK and colonies." So people arrived entirely legally, and to a large extent viewed themselves as British citizens, although that was a kind of concept that was introduced later. Then, as the whole kind of toxic debate about immigration began to develop, much as it has continued to intensify decade after decade, politicians began to look at the numbers of people arriving from former colonies, Commonwealth countries, and impose increasingly restrictive new bits of legislation that tightened up the kind of 1948 Act. And that happened kind of gradually in the 1950s, 1960s, until 1973, when a very restrictive piece of immigration legislation was introduced. And that 1973 kind of date is significant, because the vast majority of people who got caught up initially in this, in the hostile environment problems that I began to see, had arrived before 1973 and had never updated their documentation, or had somehow existed entirely legally in a kind of semi-documented status, in a slightly kind of grey area where they were here entirely legally, but they were unable to prove it. And that hadn't mattered at all, not least because we're a country that doesn't have ID cards. We've never had a kind of culture of demanding that people show their papers until 2010 onwards, when the coalition government came and had a series of David Cameron had made a commitment to cut net migration to the tens of thousands. It was a kind of undeliverable commitment. Net migration was going up with every quarter, and those figures were appearing in the newspapers every quarter. And he really rallied his cabinet to attempt to introduce measures that would somehow have an impact on illegal immigration and create this really hostile environment for illegal migrants that Theresa May went on to announce. And it was the kind of it was the coming together of the series of policies that were introduced in 2014 and in 2016, reacting with this this kind of invisible changing of people's status in the 1950s and 60s that caused really catastrophic consequences. I think the hostile environment policies are quite hard to understand because there are a whole raft of them. But broadly, what they sought to do was to take the role of immigration enforcement and border guard away from just something, checks that are done at the border as you enter the country, and introduce them much more into kind of daily life. So that people were finding that their immigration status was being checked when they went to hospital to see whether or not they were eligible for free NHS treatment. people were having their immigration status checked when they applied for a driving license or a bank account or a mobile phone contract, or when they went to renew their own passport or apply for any kind of benefit or pension. Suddenly they had to prove that they were here legally. And from kind of 2013 onwards, people who had for decades existed absolutely happily without ever having a passport were suddenly being asked to prove some kind of documentation to show that they weren't illegal immigrants. And for many, many people, that was extremely problematic.
And it's right, though, isn't it, Amelia, that at the time that the specific legislation was introduced, there were a small number of MPs who raised it with Theresa May and said that this is going to cause a very real problem for people who are from the Windrush generation. Is that right?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's been a lot of kind of digging around into what level of warnings there were to Theresa May's Home Office in the period when they were thinking about introducing these measures. And it's absolutely the case that more or less every single immigration rights organization, every single human rights group, race relations organizations, campaign groups came together in a kind of huge and actually very powerful collective and presented to the Home Office research that was considered during the kind of compilation of the impact assessment that they have to do before legislation is passed. And they said you need to be aware that this could have an impact on people who've been here for a long time, but who, for whatever reason, don't have documentary evidence to prove it. In Parliament, Diane Abbott was very clear that she said it's almost impossible to produce a hostile environment for illegal immigrants without also creating a hostile environment for people who look like immigrants. Mm-hmm. And that point was made over and over again, that there's a kind of clearly quite a serious potential for racist decisions from, for example, landlords who don't have the expertise to judge whether or not a prospective tenant has got the correct visa or passport to be in this country. And so both landlords and employers were told that they faced much increased fines if they rented property to people who weren't in the country legally. And so that the concern was, and it was a concern that was raised by conservative politicians like Eric Pickles as well as Diane Abbott, that if you don't have that expertise, then you're going to go for shortcuts, and those kind of shortcuts will be looking at a prospective tenant and thinking, well, what do they look like? What do they sound like? What color is their skin? And what does their surname look like? And so it kind of introduces a real risk of discriminatory decisions.
Mm-hmm. I've got quite a few questions coming through actually now, Amelia, and some complimentary comments as well. People saying that they followed your work and they think it's fantastic. We've got Sarah Cox is who says that she's followed your work for a long time and admires your persistence. She asks specifically, actually, and I think you answer this in the book. Was your editor happy to give you free rein and give you all the time that you needed to research the subject in such depth?
Yes. I think I'm really lucky to work for The Guardian, which, although we do have financial problems. We're still well resourced enough to have quite a number of reporters, and I've got I don't really have a kind of very clear job description, so I'm a reporter. So as long as I've got kind of interesting things that I'm working on, then I'm kind of, I don't have a beat that I have to be kind of thinking about all the time. Yeah. And I think it was obvious to Guardian editors really immediately that the kind of treatment meted out to Paulette Wilson and to Anthony Bryan was both appalling and also really hard to understand and merited investigation. But it took a really long time, because I was aware quite quickly that there were other people facing perhaps not such severe circumstances as Paulette and Anthony, but really life-shattering problems. So people who were had been made homeless, or one man who'd been refused cancer treatment, or people who'd been wrongly sacked from their jobs after decades teaching, or just endless examples. But initially it was quite hard to persuade people that it was a good idea for them to give an interview, go on the record, have their picture in the newspaper. So it did take quite a long time to gather enough kind of persuasive examples that this was a really widespread problem. And I do write about this in the book that I've written, which kind of looks at what caused the problem. It looks at the history, but it also tries to talk a bit about what it's like inside a newsroom and what all of the kind of competing pressures are. And it was a really difficult time as a reporter to kind of not to feel discouraged, I suppose, at sometimes. And I've wanted occasionally for these pieces to be on the front page, and I couldn't always get them there. It's difficult.
One thing that really struck me, actually, Amelia, in the introduction to the book, you say that journalists are meant to be cool, neutral, and collected, but that when writing this book, you found yourself at time often being none of these, and that really struck me, actually, about both what you wrote in your articles and what you write in the book. And to use the term betrayal is an incredibly strong term to use to describe what you describe in the book, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly upsetting thing to have to write about. And I don't like to use that word upsetting, because it is sort of it is my job to be really professional, but the kind of intensity of mistreatment was so extraordinary that it was genuinely extremely disturbing to have to sit down with people and kind of do very in-depth interviews that went back to their earliest childhood. Talked to lots of people who were who'd moved from the Caribbean to Britain when they were kind of babies, 3 months, 2 years, 3 years, who then had long productive lives here, and had only been exposed to all of these difficulties as they reached pension age, and that whole kind of life sweep was really important as part of the reporting. But it meant that all of the conversations that I had with the people I was talking to were they weren't about just sort of one issue, one kind of one problem in their lives. That they were about their entire lives, and to see people being so badly treated at the end of a kind of kind of after half a century of living, paying taxes, being, considering themselves British, was really, was really upsetting and made me really angry. And so I suppose in a way that's a kind of quite a motivating emotion, because maybe continue with something that was quite difficult for a long time. But the really upsetting thing is that I'm still meeting people who are who haven't been extracted from all of this 2 years after all of the initial apologies.
Well, I think we'll come on to the question of Wendy Williams's review and what the government has done since then. Before that, though, we're continuing to get loads and loads of comments. Somebody called Butter Wouldn't Melt, apparently, says, I remember listening to Amelia talk about this issue at Birkbeck University. It was an interesting evening, and also sitting in limbo almost left me in tears. Heartbreaking. And Amelia, I think the guy who couldn't get cancer treatment, that was Sylvester Marshall, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
I think he is somebody who lives in Lambeth, and I remember when I read that bit of the book and him talking about how he found himself homeless and on the streets and so on, it made me wonder whether he's somebody who I may have walked past in the street and just paid no regard to. And it really is, it's that chilling when you look at the individual stories that you focus on in the book, isn't it?
And there was something about his situation that I think really disturbed people to a new degree. And I don't know whether that's because we feel very strongly that the NHS shouldn't be turning away kind of 60-year-old people who have prostate cancer. But certainly that was the article that got published in March of 2018 that first managed to trigger some kind of political response. Because interestingly, up until that point, we've been publishing quite a few of these really, really disturbing cases in The Guardian, and there hadn't been any political response really at all. The only response was a response from the Home Office. Each time that we would publish, we had to have to go to the Home Office and say, do you want to comment on this case? And they would say, well, that individual needs to get legal advice, and they need to apply for to naturalize here, and then there would be a kind of quite a bland comment that said, we value the contribution of people who came to this country after the Second World War and contributed to the rebuilding of our country in the wake of the war. So it was exactly the same response that would come from the Home Office every time, and it was a really enraging response because people who had been sacked from their jobs and who were often facing imminent eviction weren't people who had the funds to get lawyers on the whole, and legal aid for this kind of issue for immigration had been largely abolished with the legal aid cuts that came in kind of post 2010, and the applications for citizenship cost over £1,000. So it just But anyway, there was almost no political response until that case of Sylvester Marshall attracted some interest from Jeremy Corbyn.
Mm-hmm. Amelia, I've got what looks like a series of comments from Tony Purdue, which culminates in a question which I think you're going to be able to answer relatively easily.
Yeah.
He begins by saying the work of David Olusoga is very good. And then I remember Sarah O'Connor in one of his documentaries, presumably one of David's. She died. The Labour government at the time wanted to invite former members of the Waffen SS to settle here before black people from the Caribbean. I'm so disgusted. And then he asks, Did Amelia meet Sarah O'Connor?
Yes. And in fact, I've dedicated this book to her because she was one of the people who I spoke to a lot in the first few months of 2018. She had arrived as I think as a 6-year-old, and had married, had 4 children, had worked here for decades, had kind of done, she felt, I mean, she'd never even questioned whether or not she was British. It was just an absolute assumption. And she was, I think she changed her job for some reason in 2018, had a month in between, and then tried to begin the new job, and was told that she wasn't allowed to work here because she was here illegally. And she did manage to get citizenship. She had a kind of ceremony with her daughter and sent me beautiful pictures of her getting it, although she felt pretty angry about the fact that she'd had to go through all of that process to prove something that she felt was actually not something she had to prove. But she died last year. She died in the autumn of 2018, and I mean, who knows? But she was certainly under an enormous amount of stress.
Amelia, is there another part of the book that you'd like to read to us?
Oh, yes, I would. Thank you. Jocelyn John's experience is one of the most disturbing cases to emerge from the scandal. Jocelyn arrived from London in 1963 at the age of 4, with her mother, travelling on a Grenadian passport as a British subject. She went to primary and secondary school in Hammersmith, then began working with hotels in London. For a while, she worked at the Ritz and later at the Hilton. Around 2009, she lost her Grenadian passport, which contained the crucial stamp giving her indefinite leave to remain. She had trouble getting a new passport because her mother, who was unmarried when Jocelyn was born, got married when she was 8 and changed her daughter's surname from Mitchell to John. She never registered the change, however, so there was a discrepancy between her birth certificate and the name she'd used all her adult life. Jocelyn spent several years attempting to sort out her papers without success. And by 2014, she had been classified as someone who was living in Britain illegally. She lost her job and was unable to find new work because she had no papers. She could no longer afford her rent, so for a while she was living in a homeless hostel. But she lost her job, she lost her bed there because the government does not fund hostel places for people who are classified as illegal immigrants. She spent 2 years staying with relatives, sleeping on sofas on the floor. During that time, she managed to gather 75 pages of evidence proving that she had spent a lifetime in the UK. Bank statements, dentist records, medical files, national insurance and tax records, letters from her primary school, from friends and family. But inexplicably, this was not enough to satisfy immigration staff. Every letter Jocelyn received from the Home Office warned her that she was liable to be detained and deported to Grenada, a country she had left more than 50 years earlier. She began to feel nervous about opening the door in case immigration officers were outside waiting to put handcuffs on her and drive her away. I was very frightened, she told me. A Home Office leaflet encouraging people to opt for voluntary departure, illustrated with cheerful, brightly coloured aeroplanes and published around the same time as the Go Home vans were launched, said, "We know that many people are living in the Home Office. We know that many people living in the UK illegally want to go home, but feel scared of approaching the Home Office directly. They may fear being arrested and detained. For those returning voluntarily, there are these key benefits. They avoid being arrested and having to live in detention until a travel document can be obtained. They can leave the UK in a more dignified manner than if their removal is enforced. This appeal to the desire for a dignified departure was a shrewd tactic on the part of the Home Office. The idea of being forcibly taken away by guards terrified Jocelyn. Meanwhile, she was getting deeper and deeper into debt, borrowing money from a younger brother, until eventually she concluded it was no longer fair to continue relying on him. When the hostile environment is working well, it exhausts people into submission. It piles up humiliation and stress and fear until people give up resisting. In November 2016, she finally decided that a so-called voluntary departure would be easier than trying to survive inside the ever-tightening embrace of Home Office hostility. Officials booked her on a flight on Christmas Day. When she asked if she could spend a last Christmas with her brother and 5 sisters, staff rebooked her onto a flight on Boxing Day. She was so desperate, she felt that this was the best option. By that point, she estimated she must have attempted around a dozen times to explain to Home Office staff over the phone, in person, and in writing that they'd made a mistake, but no one was prepared to listen to her. I don't think that they looked at the letters I wrote. I think they had a quota to fill and they needed to deport people. No one was willing to help, she said. A final Home Office letter told her, "You are a person who is liable to be detained. You must report with your baggage to Gatwick South, Virgin Atlantic Airways check-in desk on the 27th of December. The letter resorted to the favoured Home Office technique of scaring people with capitals, reminding her, in her last few weeks in Britain, you may not enter employment, paid or unpaid, or engage in any business or profession. It also informed her that her baggage allowance, as she packed up after a lifetime in the UK, was 20 kilos, and you will be expected to pay for any excess." So Jocelyn did go back to Grenada and had, unsurprisingly, a really horrific time there, trying to fit in a country that she had no close connection to. And it was only when her brother saw news of the government apologising about this in April 2018 that she was able to get home. And she was actually sent a ticket on British Airways by the local High Commission. But by that point, she'd already spent, I think, 2 years living in a country that she, had left as a 4-year-old. Yeah. And I do think her experience is just beyond extraordinary.
Yeah. Amelia, can you remind me who one of the stories, and this was another, they all struck me and stayed with me, but there was one where there's a guy who worked in a school, and the school, he'd worked there for a long time, hadn't he? And the school called him in and said, "We're sorry, we're going to have to let you go." Mm. And he still, and it really left a lump in my throat. He felt he needed to finish a shift looking after the children before then packing up his stuff and going. Who was that?
So he's a really amazing man called Michael Brathwaite, who teaches in a school or taught in a school in Camden. And he taught there for 15 years. He was a teaching assistant and he looked after children with special needs. And he got the sack from the head teacher who he'd worked with for a long time, who was very worried. The head teacher was very worried that he was going to have to pay a £20,000 fine for wrongly employing an illegal immigrant. But Michael was so fond of his students and was so aware of the kind of practical difficulties of leaving school during, in the middle of your working day, that he continued, and he took them swimming at the swimming pool down the road, and walked them back up the road back to the school before packing up everything that he'd kind of gathered and left in his cupboard over 15 years and leaving. But he remains absolutely furious, understandably, about what happened to him, and also about the failure of people who he knew well, like his employers, but people within the council and also within the Home Office, to just listen to him, to hear his voice, to kind of hear his whole life story spent in Britain, and not question whether or not perhaps a mistake had somehow been made.
Yeah. But you've talked there, Amelia, about his employers, about the council, about the Home Office, but there's obviously a question here about the politicians, and one of the questions that Suresh Naluri has put in the chat here, I think, is a very pertinent one. He asks, is there any indication that Cameron and May understand the depths of despair that people experienced and are still experiencing, as you've just indicated there?
I mean, I've got no way of knowing. All I know is that Theresa May has repeatedly, publicly apologised over and over again, and made, while she was still in power, commitments to righting the wrongs done to this generation. But it's absolutely the case that that she wasn't aware of this issue when we were writing about it at The Guardian a lot. And I think it is quite telling, because obviously she was very busy. You know, this was the time of Brexit. She perhaps didn't read The Guardian very, very frequently, and that I completely understand. But it's interesting that none of her aides thought that it was an issue that she ought to be briefed on. So when issues, for example, about Sylvester Marshall being told that he needed to pay, I think, £48,000 to receive prostate cancer radiotherapy treatment, when that was raised at Prime Minister Question Time, she didn't know about it. And I just think that that says something about the extent to which people around her and people in the Home Office and ministers felt that this group of people was a group of people that, you know, perhaps didn't matter, or that people wouldn't, you know, that voters wouldn't particularly pay much attention to. And they were proved, you know, absolutely wrong on that front.
I think I've got a message here from Liz Wheatley, who says, I think Michael is he's a member of Camden Unison, and they managed to keep his second job in Camden following a campaign. So that sounds like a...
Yeah, well, as I said something, you know, disobliging about the council, I was thinking that there was somebody within the council who was actually very supportive and kind to him, and the parents at his school were incredibly supportive, and the union also. But yeah, it wasn't enough to persuade the whoever it was who made the decision at his school. And, you know, from the perspective of the employers were being sent these leaflets all the time saying, if you employ somebody who doesn't have the correct documentation, you face a £20,000 fine. I mean, it's, you know, it stands to reason people were increasingly nervous.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose we're coming towards the end now, so let's fast forward to today and Wendy Williams's review, and what that review told us and where we're at now in terms of those people who've been the victims of the Windrush betrayal and the situation that they're in. Have we made progress? Does Wendy Williams' review offer a way forward?
Yeah, so we have made progress, but I feel really torn always, because on the one hand, that some incredible commitments have been made, and some real positive steps have been taken. So over 12,000 people who didn't previously have documentation now have documentation. Many of them now have British citizenship. And it's kind of, on the one hand, that's what they should always have had. And it's just a confirmation of status that they already had. But on the other hand, it does mean that those 12,000 people are no longer worried about the possible arrival of immigration enforcement officers banging on their door in the night. So it's a really positive thing. Mm-hmm. And the Home Office task force that organised that has done it pretty efficiently. In parallel, there was a compensation scheme organised, and it was done with real thought and consideration by a barrister called Martin Ford, who really, I think, poured his full energies into getting it right. It isn't quite right, and I don't think that's particularly his fault, but it's proving to be very, very slow in paying out compensation. So it's been in operation for, I think, 15 months now, and the last figures show that 60 people have had compensation totaling around, actually the figures have gone up, so about £1 million, I think, has now been paid out. But you have to remember that the official kind of internal estimates of how much the government is prepared to pay out or could end up paying out said that it could be anywhere between 200 million and 500 million. So to have only paid out to 60 people £1 million at this stage is not great. And the reason why it's really not great is that a lot of people who lost their jobs or who were made homeless are still in huge financial difficulties as a result of that. So it's not just about having kind of payments that make people feel that the government understands that they're really sorry. It's about helping people to extract themselves from really acute financial difficulties that they're still experiencing as a direct result of this Home Office mistake. So on the compensation side, things could be better. The Wendy Williams report is a very forensic 300-page document that looks into what went wrong and comes up with 30 recommendations for what what the government should do to put things right. And interestingly, 10 days ago, she went on the radio on the day before the Windrush Day and said that there was a grave risk that this could happen again if the government didn't adopt her 30 recommendations. And the next day, the government did adopt them. So that, that's also positive. And within those recommendations, there is a requirement or a suggestion that the hostile environment policy should be reviewed. So I think that's what we have to really keep an eye on over the next few months, is whether or not, in saying that those recommendations are all going to be adopted, has the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, actually really made a commitment to reviewing the whole raft of legislation that makes up the hostile environment. If that happens, and if it's kind of reviewed and rethought in a radical way, that would be very positive. But I think the jury is very much out.
That was very diplomatically said, I think, Amelia. There are huge numbers of comments here, which is an indication of just how engaging this conversation has been and how valuable the work that you've done has been, Amelia, and I thank you for that. Quite a lot of technical questions, which I think is probably a little bit unfair to ask you in terms of settled status, the impact.
Yeah, I can see about the settled status, and it is really important and worrying that the whole this whole process of looking at the 3.5 million EU nationals who require settled status is coming up. I mean, we'll have to see.
Do you think, I suppose one kind of big final question, we're living in quite an extraordinary time, aren't we? Living in lockdown, we've had the impact that coronavirus is having and disproportionate impact upon Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. We've had the sudden re-emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement all around the world, including here in Britain. What, if any, impact do you think that will have on the kinds of issues that you've been researching and writing about?
Well, it has absolutely brought consideration of the merits or otherwise of the hostile environment back to the fore. Throughout the pandemic, we've been seeing the impact of the hostile environment again, hitting the headlines. So the whole issue around NHS workers who are required to pay the NHS surcharge if they're international medical staff, having to pay to access a service that they're working for and paying their taxes already to fund. That's another hostile environment policy, as is the no recourse to public funds policy that is making life very difficult for a lot of people who come here entirely legally with the right to work here, but who are not allowed to claim most benefits when they lose their work, as many of them have done as a result of the pandemic. So I think it is requiring people to kind of think again about whether or not we kind of want to have an immigration system built on this hostile environment. And I think also there is a real desire by politicians, by the government, to be seen to be doing the right thing on Windrush. I think absolutely the protests have heightened the need for politicians to kind of say the right things. But equally, they've been saying the right things pretty consistently for the last 2 years, and still so many people are waiting for justice.
Well, Amelia, you have played a fantastically valuable role in exposing this, getting people to campaign and to protest and making a real difference to people's lives. So you really should be incredibly proud of what you've done. And I certainly think everyone who has been listening in, if you haven't got a copy of the Windrush Betrayal, please do buy a copy and tell your friends about it, and tell your friends about this broadcast as well. We've got a whole series of complimentary comments. Matt Lacey says love and strength. Future Heist says this is so interesting. Matt Lacey again says share this video widely, everyone, get the truth out there. And solidarity, numerous comments like that. But Julian Vaughan, brilliant work, and shows the possible effect, the positive effect that journalism can bring, and I would absolutely endorse that. Amelia, I'm going to let you go.
Thank you. It's been really, really interesting to talk to you, really interesting to have the questions, and I'm just so grateful to you for spending the evening doing it. It's a kind of really fun way to spend summer Friday evening, and yeah, just even in lockdown, it's amazing to be able to take part in this kind of event. So thank you.
Well, let me finish by echoing the words of, the words of Sarah Cox, who I know Sarah, and I know that Sarah probably knew Paul for a lot longer and a lot better than me. And she says, thank you. I think Paul Foot would be really pleased that you got this award. And I think that that's absolutely right, because it was an outstanding piece of journalism. And I know that it's work that you're continuing to do. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for sharing your time with us here at Bookmarks. And thank you to everybody who has tuned in. It is going to be available on various platforms. YouTube, Facebook, whatever. So please do encourage your friends, your family, your workmates, your neighbors to log on and check out what has been a fascinating, very important and very passionate discussion. And also, let me finish with a plug for bookmarks. Obviously, the period of the pandemic and lockdown has been very difficult for independent retailers. Bookmarks is a small independent socialist bookshop, which will have found it difficult. It hasn't obviously been open during this time, but it has been available for online orders. Log on, have a look at its catalogue, and you can get not only Amelia's fantastic book, but a whole range of other literature and pamphlets and gifts as well. So let's finish with a shout out for bookmarks. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Amelia. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Stay strong.
Been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.